So right here we have the sine and cosine graph for one period. Right here we have a formula. This formula could also have a cosine here. The same formula works with a cosine bx plus k. It still affects it the same because sine and cosine are very close graphs. As you can see, they're very similar. So the number in front, the A on a sine graph is the same thing as what it's been doing for every other graph you've been doing. Hasn't A done a vertical stretch? A was always your vertical stretch. But for a trig function, the vertical stretch has its own unique name. It's called the amplitude. Okay? Your A is your amplitude. It has its own name, A for amplitude. It's kind of nice. Which for every other graph was the same thing. It stretched it. Now, do you guys also remember doesn't A also flip possibly? So it's your amplitude, but it can also flip a graph. It's a question mark because does it always flip? No. It depends on if you have a plus or a minus. If it's going to flip, it depends on if the A value is positive or negative. So amplitude plus the ability to flip. So it has two characteristics hiding in the A. But it's kind of nice, A for amplitude. Awesome. Next, B. Well, we've never had a B on any graph. Well, what the B is the vertical, the horizontal shrink or stretch. And in trig, the horizontal shrink and stretch is called your period. So for this one, B gives you your period. It's not your period. It creates your period. Now, how do we create a period with my B? Here's the formula. Period, to find our period, it's going to be 2 pi divided by B. So to find your period, you take the B value and you divide it from 2 pi. Where that comes from is related to, do you notice one cycle is normally 2 pi? That's where the 2 pi comes from. So B tells you what fraction of 2 pi you want. And that's kind of helps you find the period size. Because it's a horizontal shrink or stretch. This is going to be, you'll see on other problems. And then K is what it's always been doing. For every problem you've done all year long, K has been your vertical shift. But in terms of trig, it has its own name. The vertical shift in trig is called your midline. So it has its own name, and it's always going to be y equals k. K is your midline. It's the middle of your graph that's been pushed up or down. Because in the original, isn't your midline 0? So if I shift this up, won't your midline move up with it at the same rate? So A for amplitude, awesome. Don't forget if could flip. B gives you your period, needing this little formula. And K is your midline, or the middle of your graph, shifted like always. So if I want to find my midline amplitude period, your midline is always your K. So boom, there it is. So your midline is going to be this right here, so it's y equals -2. Remember, midline's a line, a horizontal line. So it's y equals -2. Your amplitude is that right there, your vertical stretch or shrink. So your amplitude is 6. All right, and lastly, your period comes from this 4. It's not 4, it comes from the 4. And the formula is you take 2 pi and divide by b, or the 4 value is b. We call it b. And when you reduce that, you get pi over 2. So that is your period. So the period's the hardest because you have to do an alteration. Next problem right here. I want my midline, so my midline's right there. So my midline's going to be, boom, y equals 1. My amplitude is right there in front, so it's 2. Not -2, it's 2. But let's, for the sake of remembering, this is actually going to be flipped. So let's put flipped just to remind us, if we're graphing, it's going to be flipped. The amplitude is only the 2, though. The negative just tells you the direction of the amplitude. Lastly, okay, do you understand there's really a 1 hiding there? And theta is really x. Theta is just like x. So really, isn't this 1/3? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take 2 pi and divide by 1/3. Because that's really 1/3 theta. So that's a little tricky, but if you take 2 pi and divide by 1/3, isn't that times by 3 over 1? And when you multiply that, don't you get 6 pi as your period? So the midline for this graph, well, isn't it what you add? And there's nothing added. So, well, could I just add 0 here? So won't your midline be y equals 0? There's been no shift up or down, so the midline is 0. Okay. Next, my amplitude is the number in front. Well, could you put a 1 there if I wanted to? So isn't your amplitude 1, but with a flip? So you're going to have a flip. It's a 1. Amplitude is equal to 1. You're going up and down 1, but it's upside down. And lastly, right here is your b value. So I'm going to take 2 pi. So for your period, I'm going to take 2 pi, and I'm going to divide by my b value. When I do that, I get 2 pi over 1 times 3 over pi. Remember, when you divide, you flip and multiply. When you do that, the pi's disappear, leaving you 2 times 3, which is 6. So your period is 6.